The helicopter's rotor sound grew louder as thunder climbed toward the rocky ridgeline above them. Jake pushed the tired horse hard up the steep slope, knowing this might be their only chance for aerial rescue. Sarah could feel Thunder's labored breathing and the sweat foaming on his neck, but the brave animal never slowed his determined climb toward the summit. When they finally reached the top of the ridge, Sarah gasped at what she saw spread out below them. The entire valley was engulfed in flames, creating an orange and red landscape that looked like a vision of hell itself. Thick columns of smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, and she could see spot fires starting on distant hillsides where burning embers had been carried by the wind. "Sweet mother of pearl," Jake breathed, his voice filled with awe and fear. "I've lived in these mountains my whole life, and I've never seen anything like this. This fire is moving faster and burning hotter than anything in the record books." The helicopter was clearly visible now, a bright yellow water-dropping aircraft circling about a mile away as it prepared to make another pass at the fire's leading edge. Jake immediately began waving his hat over his head while Sarah held Emma up so the bright pink baby blanket would be visible from the air. But the helicopter was focused on its firefighting mission and didn't seem to notice the three small figures on the distant ridge. After several minutes of frantic waving, the aircraft completed its water drop and flew away toward its refilling station, leaving them alone on the mountaintop with the fire spreading closer every minute. "They'll be back," Jake said with more confidence than Sarah thought he felt. "Fire service runs regular patterns during major incidents. We just need to be ready when they make their next pass." While they waited, Jake used the high vantage point to study the fire's movement and plan their next move if the helicopter rescue didn't work out. Sarah watched his face as he surveyed the burning landscape, seeing the deep concern in his weathered features as he calculated distances and wind patterns with the expertise of someone who'd spent his entire life reading the mountain weather. "The fire's moving northeast, pushed by the wind," Jake observed. "If we can get down the backside of this ridge and head due west, we might be able to stay ahead of it long enough to reach the old mining road. That road connects to the highway about 10 miles from here." 10 miles sounded impossibly far to Sarah, especially with Emma in her arms and Thunder already exhausted from their desperate ride through the burning forest. But she could see the determination in Jake's face and knew he wouldn't give up as long as there was any chance of getting them to safety. Thunder had caught his breath during their brief rest and was pawing the ground impatiently, as if he understood that staying in one place too long was dangerous. The horse's instincts had proven correct so many times already that Sarah had complete faith in his judgment. If Thunder thought they needed to keep moving, then they needed to keep moving. Emma had been remarkably quiet during their ordeal, but now she was starting to fuss and cry more frequently. Sarah worried that the baby was becoming dehydrated from the heat and smoke, and she knew they needed to find water soon. She'd given Emma her last bottle hours earlier, and the stress of their situation was affecting her own ability to nurse. "There's a spring about halfway down the west face of this ridge," Jake said, noticing Sarah's concern. "Clear, cold mountain water that's never failed, even in the driest summers. We can rest there for a few minutes and get some water into both of you." Just as Jake started to guide Thunder down from the ridge, they heard the helicopter returning. This time the aircraft was flying a different pattern, and it was heading directly toward their position. Jake immediately stopped and began signaling again, this time using the reflective surface of his belt buckle to flash sunlight toward the approaching helicopter. The pilots saw them almost immediately. The helicopter changed course and began circling their position, creating powerful downdrafts that whipped dust and debris around them. Thunder stood steady despite the noise and wind, his ears laid back but his feet firmly planted on the rocky ground. Through the helicopter's windscreen, Sarah could see the pilot speaking rapidly into his radio. After a few more circles, the aircraft moved to a position about 50 yards away and began looking for a place to land. The ridgetop was mostly rocky with scattered boulders, making it challenging to find a suitable landing zone. "He's going to try to set down on that flat spot near the lightning-struck pine," Jake said, pointing to an area that looked barely large enough for the helicopter. "We need to get over there fast, before the wind changes or the fire gets any closer." Jake spurred Thunder into a careful trot across the uneven ground, avoiding loose rocks and holes that could cause a fall. Sarah held Emma tightly and tried not to think about what would happen if Thunder stumbled at this crucial moment. They were so close to rescue that she could taste it, but she'd learned not to count on anything until they were actually safe. The helicopter touched down with remarkable skill, its rotor wash creating a small dust storm around the landing zone. The pilot kept the engines running, clearly planning to take off again as quickly as possible. A crew member jumped out and ran toward them, ducking under the spinning rotor blades. "How many do we have?" the rescuer shouted over the engine noise. "3, counting the baby," Jake called back. "The mother and child need medical attention for smoke inhalation." The crew member was already reaching for Emma, his movements quick and efficient. Sarah could see medical equipment visible through the helicopter's open door, and she felt an overwhelming relief at the thought of getting proper care for her daughter. "I'm going to take the baby first," the rescuer explained. "Then, come back for you. The helicopter can't lift off with all the extra weight at this altitude." Sarah's heart clenched at the thought of being separated from Emma, even briefly, but she knew it was the safest way to get them both off the mountain. She kissed Emma's forehead and whispered words of reassurance before handing her daughter to the waiting rescuer. The man ran back to the helicopter with Emma, moving with the practiced speed of someone who'd done this many times before. Within seconds, the aircraft lifted off in a cloud of dust and smoke, carrying Sarah's most precious cargo to safety. "They'll be back for us in less than 10 minutes, Jake assured her as they watched the helicopter disappear over the ridge. "That pilot knows what he's doing, and he's not going to leave us up here." But, as they waited for the helicopter's return, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach drop. The wind had shifted, and the fire was now moving directly toward their position much faster than before. The ridge that had seemed like a safe refuge was about to become a trap, with flames climbing up both sides of the mountain. Jake saw it too, his face grim as he calculated how much time they had left. "The fire will be here in less than 5 minutes, he said quietly. "We can't wait for the helicopter." Thunder was already moving before Jake finished speaking, carrying them away from the approaching flames with the same determined urgency he'd shown all day. But Sarah could see that the horse was near the end of his strength, his stride less smooth than before and his breathing labored from exhaustion. As they rode down the backside of the ridge, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. That morning she'd been a single mother trying to build a quiet life in a mountain town. Now she was fleeing for her life with a cowboy she'd never met, trusting a horse to carry them to safety through burning wilderness. But, more than that, she was thinking about Jake Morrison and the kind of man who would risk his life for strangers without hesitation. In her years as a nurse, she'd met many brave people, but Jake's calm competence in the face of mortal danger was unlike anything she'd experienced. He was the kind of person who still existed in places like this, where self-reliance and helping your neighbors weren't just old-fashioned values but necessary survival skills. The helicopter appeared again, coming from a different direction as it searched for them on the rapidly changing landscape. Jake guided Thunder to another small clearing and began signaling frantically. The pilot spotted them quickly and began circling, but Sarah could see the difficulty in finding another landing spot on the steep mountainside. Finally, the helicopter pilot made a decision that took incredible skill and courage. Instead of landing, he brought the aircraft into a hover just a few feet above the ground, with the crew member lowering a rescue basket on a cable. "You go first," Jake said, dismounting from Thunder. "I'll help you into the basket." But Sarah shook her head. "You saved our lives today. You go first." Jake's weathered face broke into a smile despite their desperate situation. "Ma'am, my grandfather would roll over in his grave if I got in that basket before a lady. Besides, Thunder and I aren't done yet. We know another way off this mountain." The rescue basket touched down, and Jake helped Sarah climb in with gentle hands that were surprisingly tender for someone so strong and capable. As the cable began lifting her toward the helicopter, Sarah looked down at Jake standing beside his horse on the burning mountainside. "Thank you," she called down to him, but her words were lost in the rotor noise. Jake touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed to come from another century, then swung back up onto Thunder's back. Sarah watched through the helicopter's window as horse and rider disappeared into the smoke, heading for whatever escape route Jake had in mind. The helicopter crew immediately put an oxygen mask over Sarah's face and began checking her vital signs as they flew toward the medical center in town. Through the aircraft's windows, she could see the full extent of the wildfire for the first time. It covered thousands of acres and showed no signs of slowing down. When they landed at the hospital, Sarah was rushed inside where she was reunited with Emma. The baby was already receiving treatment for smoke inhalation, and the doctors assured Sarah that both of them would make full recoveries. But, as she held her daughter close, all Sarah could think about was Jake Morrison and whether he'd made it off the mountain alive. She asked every firefighter and rescue worker she met about the cowboy who'd rescued them, but, in the chaos of the ongoing emergency, no one had any information about Jake's fate. Hours passed with no word, and Sarah began to fear the worst. Finally, as dawn was breaking over Pine Ridge, a tired and soot-covered firefighter brought news that made Sarah cry with relief. Jake Morrison and his horse Thunder had made it safely to the old mining road, where they'd been picked up by a fire crew. Both man and horse were exhausted but unharmed. 3 days later, when Sarah was released from the hospital, her first stop was the Morrison Ranch. She found Jake in the barn, cleaning Thunder's hooves with the same gentle care he'd shown her and Emma during their escape from the fire. The horse Nick Thunder's hooves pounded against the rocky ground as they raced through the forest, but, despite their speed, Jake kept the horse under perfect control. Sarah had never imagined that riding could feel both terrifying and secure at the same time. Every muscle in her body was tense from holding Emma and gripping Jake's jacket, but she could feel the cowboy's steady confidence radiating through his calm posture in the saddle. The smoke was getting thicker as they rode, making it harder to see more than a few feet ahead. Sarah's eyes were streaming tears, and Emma was coughing more frequently despite the jacket wrapped around her face. Jake seemed to be navigating purely by instinct, guiding Thunder around trees and over obstacles that appeared suddenly out of the gray haze. "We're heading for Willow Creek," Jake called back to Sarah, his voice slightly muffled by the bandana he'd pulled up over his nose and mouth. "It's about 2 miles ahead, and there's a wide rocky area along the bank where the fire can't cross easily. We can follow the creek bed to safety." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure Jake could see her through the smoke. She tried to project confidence for Emma's sake, but inside she was fighting a growing panic as the world around them became an alien landscape of gray shadows and dancing flames. The familiar forest she'd walked through that morning had transformed into something from a nightmare. Thunder suddenly stopped and snorted nervously, his ears pricked forward at something Sarah couldn't see. Jake leaned forward in the saddle, studying the path ahead with intense concentration. After a moment that felt like eternity, he guided the horse sharply to the left, taking them off what little trail there had been and into deeper forest. "There's a wall of fire across the main path," Jake explained as they pushed through thick underbrush. "We'll have to take the long way around, but Thunder knows these woods as well as I do." "We'll make it." Sarah could hear the doubt creeping into Jake's voice despite his reassuring words, and that scared her more than anything else so far. If this experienced rancher was worried, their situation must be even more dangerous than she'd realized. The fire seemed to be everywhere now, cutting off escape routes faster than they could find new ones. As they rode through increasingly dense forest, Sarah began to learn more about the man who'd rescued them. Jake told her he'd been born and raised on the Morrison Ranch, which had been in his family for 4 generations. He'd been riding these mountains since he was 5 years old, first following his father and grandfather as they herded cattle through the high pastures every summer. "My great-grandfather started this ranch in 1924, Jake said as Thunder carefully picked his way down a steep slope. "He always said the land would provide for us if we learned to respect it and understand it. I never really understood what he meant until I started spending full days out here by myself." Jake's voice carried a deep love for the wilderness around them, even as it threatened their lives. Sarah realized that rescuing strangers from wildfire was probably just another part of life for someone who'd grown up in this rugged country. The mountains demanded that kind of courage and self-reliance from the people who chose to live among them. Thunder suddenly stumbled on loose rocks, and Sarah felt her heart skip a beat as the horse struggled to regain his footing. Jake remained perfectly balanced in the saddle, his body moving fluidly with the horse's recovery. Within seconds, Thunder was moving steadily again, but the near fall reminded Sarah of how precarious their situation really was. "That's why I never ride the mountains without Thunder," Jake said, patting the horse's neck affectionately. "He's gotten me out of more tight spots than I can count. Bears, mountain lions, sudden storms, and now fire.
This old boy has seen it all.
Sarah could feel the deep bond between horse and rider, built through years of facing danger together. Thunder wasn't just Jake's transportation, he was a partner who understood the cowboy's signals and trusted his judgment completely.
Sarah found herself trusting the horse almost as much as she trusted Jake.
The smoke was getting so thick that breathing was becoming difficult even with makeshift filters over their faces. Emma was crying more frequently, and Sarah worried about how much smoke the baby had already inhaled. She'd seen enough smoke inhalation cases during her nursing career to know how dangerous it could be, especially for someone so young. Just when Sarah thought the situation couldn't get worse, they heard a new sound that made Jake pull Thunder to an immediate stop. It was the unmistakable crack and crash of falling trees, somewhere very close to their position. Jake listened intently for a moment, then urged Thunder into the fastest pace yet. "The fire's taking down the big pines," Jake said grimly. "When they start falling, it means the fire's burning so hot that it's killing trees before the flames even reach them.
We need to get to open ground fast."
Thunder seemed to understand the urgency, stretching into a ground-covering gallop despite the dangerous terrain. Sarah held Emma tighter and tried not to think about what would happen if they encountered a falling tree. The horse was moving with incredible speed and agility, jumping over logs and rocks that Sarah could barely see through the smoke. As they rode, Jake told Sarah more about the ranch and his family. His parents had moved to Arizona 5 years earlier, leaving him to run the operation with help from 2 full-time hands and seasonal workers. He'd never married, though he'd come close once to a woman who'd ultimately decided that ranch life was too isolated and unpredictable for her taste. She wasn't wrong, Jake admitted as they slowed to navigate a particularly rocky section.
"This life isn't for everyone.
You have to be willing to face whatever the mountains throw at you, whether it's a blizzard in May or a wildfire in October. But, for those of us who belong here, there's nowhere else we'd rather be." Sarah found herself thinking about her own reasons for moving to Pine Ridge. She'd wanted a simpler life, away from the constant stress and danger of working in a big city hospital. But now she was learning that rural life came with its own unique risks, ones that required different skills and a different kind of courage than she'd needed in Denver. Thunder suddenly veered sharply to the right, nearly unseating Sarah despite her tight grip on Jake's jacket. Through the smoke, she caught a glimpse of what had caused the horse's quick reaction. A massive pine tree was falling directly across their path, its trunk easily 4 feet in diameter. If Thunder hadn't sensed the danger and changed direction, they would have been crushed.
"Good boy, Thunder," Jake said, his voice tight with controlled fear. That was too close for comfort.
The falling tree crashed to the ground behind them with a sound like thunder, sending up a shower of sparks and burning debris. Sarah realized they'd missed death by a matter of seconds, and only the horse's incredible instincts had saved them. She found herself speaking words of thanks to an animal she'd been afraid of just an hour earlier. As they continued through the increasingly dangerous forest, Jake shared stories of other emergencies he'd faced in the mountains. There was the time he'd found a family of hikers lost in a sudden snowstorm, and the evening he'd helped deliver a baby when a woman went into labor at his ranch while her husband was away getting supplies. Sarah began to understand that Jake's rescue of her and Emma wasn't unusual behavior for him, it was simply what people did for each other in this remote country. "Out here, you can't wait for someone else to come help," Jake explained. "When trouble hits, you deal with it yourself or people die. That's just the reality of living this far from town." Sarah thought about her own background as a nurse and realized she'd always felt the same way about medical emergencies. When someone needed help, you didn't hesitate or make excuses, you did whatever was necessary to save them. Maybe she and Jake had more in common than she'd initially thought. The sound of rushing water gradually became audible over the roar of the fire, and Jake's posture in the saddle became noticeably more relaxed. They were getting close to Willow Creek, and Sarah allowed herself to hope that they might actually escape the fire's path. Thunder seemed to sense it too, picking up his pace with renewed energy. But their relief was short-lived. As they approached the creek, Jake pulled Thunder to a stop at the edge of a steep embankment. Below them, Willow Creek was running much higher and faster than normal, swollen by early snowmelt from the high peaks. What should have been a shallow stream was now a raging torrent that would be impossible to cross safely. The creek's running too high, Jake said, his voice heavy with disappointment. All this dry weather, and now we get a flash flood just when we need the water level to be low. We can't risk trying to cross here with the baby. Sarah felt her heart sink as she looked at the rushing water below them. It was 30 feet across and moving so fast that logs and debris were being swept downstream like toys. Even an experienced swimmer would have trouble in those conditions, and attempting a crossing with Emma would be suicide. Jake studied the creek carefully, looking for any possibility of a safe crossing. But the flood had changed the entire landscape, washing out the usual ford and creating new rapids where there had once been calm pools. After several minutes of searching, he shook his head and turned Thunder away from the water. "We'll have to find another way," Jake said. "There's a bridge about 5 miles upstream, but we'll have to circle around through some rough country to get there. And we'll be moving closer to the main fire front." Sarah could hear the frustration in Jake's voice, and she knew their situation had just become much more dangerous. The creek had been their planned escape route, their safe passage away from the fire. Now they were forced to continue traveling through burning forest with no guarantee they'd find another way out. As they turned away from the creek, Sarah caught sight of something that made her gasp. On the far side of the water, she could see a road, and on that road was a fire truck racing toward town with its lights flashing. Help was so close she could almost touch it, but the raging creek made it impossible to reach. Jake saw her looking at the truck and nodded grimly. "That's the road to Pine Ridge. If we could have crossed here, we'd have been safe in 10 minutes. Now we've got at least an hour of hard riding ahead of us, assuming we can find a way around the main fire." Thunder snorted and pawed the ground nervously as ash continued to fall around them. The horse could sense Jake's tension, and he was becoming increasingly agitated by the smoke and noise. Sarah could feel the animal's muscles trembling beneath her, and she wondered how much longer he could maintain the pace they'd been keeping. Jake seemed to read her thoughts. "Thunder's tough, but he's been running hard for over an hour now. We'll need to rest him soon, or he won't be able to carry us out of here." But, as Sarah looked around at the burning forest surrounding them, she couldn't imagine anywhere that would be safe enough to stop. The fire seemed to be everywhere now, and the smoke was so thick that visibility was down to just a few yards in any direction. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, Thunder's ears pricked forward again, but this time his posture was alert rather than fearful. Jake immediately noticed the change and listened carefully to sounds that Sarah couldn't hear over the fire's roar. "Do you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice suddenly filled with new hope. Sarah strained to listen, and gradually she became aware of a rhythmic thumping sound coming from somewhere above them. It was getting louder, and Jake was smiling for the first time since he'd found them in the clearing. "That's a helicopter," Jake said, spurring Thunder into motion toward a nearby ridgeline. "The fire service must be running air support. If we can get to high ground where they can see us, we might have another way out of here." Thunder began climbing the steep slope with renewed energy, as if he too understood that rescue might be coming from above. Sarah held Emma close and allowed herself to hope once again that they might escape this nightmare alive. Sarah Martinez never thought her morning walk with baby Emma would turn into a fight for survival. The 28-year-old nurse had moved to the small mountain town of Pine Ridge, Colorado, just 6 months earlier, seeking a quieter life after her divorce. The crisp October air felt perfect as she strapped 10-month-old Emma into the stroller and headed down the familiar trail that wound through the aspen groves behind their rented cabin. The golden leaves danced in the gentle breeze, and Emma gurgled happily, reaching for the colorful foliage. Sarah smiled, feeling a rare moment of peace. Life as a single mother wasn't easy, but mornings like this reminded her why she'd chosen this mountain sanctuary over the chaos of city life. She'd left her job at Denver General Hospital to work part-time at the local clinic, trading financial security for a chance to be more present in her daughter's life. As they walked deeper into the forest, Sarah noticed something odd. The birds had gone silent. The usual chatter of squirrels and rustling of small animals had stopped completely. Even Emma seemed to sense the change, her babbling replaced by an unusual quiet. Sarah paused, listening carefully to the stillness that had descended over the woods like a heavy blanket. Then, she smelled it. Smoke. Not the familiar scent of someone's fireplace, but something sharper, more urgent. Her nursing training kicked in, and she immediately thought of the drought warnings that had been posted around town for weeks. The mountains had received little rain all summer, leaving the forest dry as kindling. Sarah quickly turned the stroller around, but, as she did, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. A low, distant roar, like a freight train approaching. She'd heard that sound described in the wildfire safety meetings the town had held, but hearing it in person was terrifying. The fire was moving fast, much faster than she'd imagined possible. Panic began to set in as she hurried back toward the trail. Emma started crying, perhaps sensing her mother's fear. Sarah tried to stay calm, remembering that babies could pick up on anxiety. She needed to think clearly. The main trail back to town would take at least 20 minutes at a normal pace, but pushing a stroller over the rocky path while running seemed impossible. The smell of smoke grew stronger with each passing minute. Sarah could see gray wisps beginning to filter through the trees ahead of her, and the distant roar was getting louder. Her heart pounded as she realized the fire was moving toward the trail, cutting off her planned escape route. The wind had picked up, and she could feel it pushing the smoke in her direction. Sarah stopped and pulled out her cell phone, her hands shaking as she tried to dial 911. No signal. The mountains had always had spotty coverage, but now the lack of connection felt like a death sentence. She looked around desperately, trying to remember the emergency procedures from the town meetings. Find an opening, stay away from trees, get to water if possible. But there was no water nearby, and the forest stretched endlessly in all directions. Sarah had taken this walk dozens of times, but now the familiar paths seemed foreign and threatening. The smoke was getting thicker, making Emma cough and cry harder. Sarah lifted her baby from the stroller and held her close, abandoning the heavy stroller beside the trail. With Emma in her arms, Sarah started moving as quickly as she could through the trees. She remembered seeing a small clearing about half a mile to the north during one of their previous walks. It wasn't much, but it might give them a better chance than staying surrounded by dry pines and aspens. Every step felt like a race against time as the roar behind them grew louder and more menacing. The forest floor was covered with dry leaves and fallen branches that crackled under her feet. Sarah tried to move quietly, irrationally afraid that the noise might somehow attract the fire's attention. Emma had stopped crying and was clinging to her mother's shirt with tiny fists, her blue eyes wide with confusion and fear. As they climbed over fallen logs and pushed through thick underbrush, Sarah's legs began to burn with effort. She wasn't used to hiking while carrying a baby, and the adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving her feeling weak and shaky. But she couldn't stop. The orange glow was now visible through the trees behind them, and ash was beginning to fall like gray snow. When they finally reached the clearing Sarah remembered, her heart sank. It was much smaller than she'd recalled, maybe 50 feet across, surrounded by towering pines that could easily carry the fire right over their heads. But it was all they had. Sarah sat down in the center of the opening, pulling Emma close and trying to think of what to do next. The air was getting harder to breathe. Sarah pulled off her light jacket and wrapped it around Emma's face to filter some of the smoke. She used her own shirt to cover her nose and mouth, tasting the bitter ash on her lips. The fire's roar was so loud now that it seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the orange glow was getting brighter. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to pray, though she'd never been particularly religious. She thought about her parents in Arizona, who'd worried about her moving to such a remote place. She thought about her ex-husband, who'd said she was being irresponsible taking Emma away from the city's resources. Maybe they'd been right. Maybe her quest for a simple, peaceful life had put her daughter in terrible danger. Just as despair began to overwhelm her, Sarah heard something that made her look up. Over the roar of the approaching fire, she could hear the sound of hoofbeats. At first, she thought she was imagining things, but the sound got clearer and closer. Someone was riding hard through the forest, coming in their direction. Sarah stood up, still holding Emma, and started shouting as loudly as she could. Her voice was hoarse from the smoke, but she kept calling for help, waving her free arm frantically. The hoofbeats seemed to pause, then changed direction, heading straight for the clearing. Through the haze of smoke and falling ash, Sarah saw the most beautiful sight of her life. A horse and rider burst through the tree line at the edge of the clearing, moving with the kind of confidence that only came from years of experience in the wilderness. The man on horseback looked like he'd stepped out of an old Western movie, complete with a worn cowboy hat and leather chaps. But there was nothing old-fashioned about the urgency in his movements. He rode straight to Sarah and Emma, his horse dancing nervously as ash continued to fall around them. The rider's face was grim but determined, and his eyes quickly assessed the situation with the practiced calm of someone who'd faced danger before. "Ma'am, we need to get out of here right now," he said, his voice deep and steady despite the chaos around them. "This fire is moving faster than anything I've seen in 30 years of ranching." "Can you ride?" Sarah shook her head, too overwhelmed to speak. She'd never been on a horse in her life, and the idea of riding with a baby seemed impossible. But, as she looked at the stranger's face, she saw something that gave her hope. This wasn't someone who gave up easily, and he clearly had a plan. The cowboy dismounted quickly and walked toward them, his boots crunching on the dried grass. Despite the danger and urgency of the situation, his movements were calm and deliberate. Sarah could see that he was probably in his early 40s, with weathered hands and the kind of tan that came from spending most of his life outdoors. There was something reassuring about his presence, like he belonged in this wild place and knew how to survive in it. "My name's Jake Morrison," he said, extending his hand to help Sarah stand. "I've got a ranch about 3 miles from here, and I was out checking on my cattle when I saw the smoke. I've been riding through these mountains my whole life, and I know a way out that the fire hasn't reached yet." Sarah felt a surge of relief so strong that her knees almost buckled. "I'm Sarah, and this is Emma. I don't know how to thank you. I thought we were going to die out here." Jake's expression softened as he looked at the baby in her arms. "No need to thank me yet, ma'am. We've still got some riding to do, and it's going to be dangerous. But my horse Thunder here is as steady as they come, and he's carried people to safety before." As if to prove the point, the large brown horse stood perfectly still despite the smoke and noise around them. Sarah could see intelligence in the animal's dark eyes, and something about the horse's calm demeanor made her feel slightly less terrified about the idea of riding. Jake quickly assessed the situation around them. The fire was definitely getting closer, and Sarah could now see actual flames flickering between the trees on the far side of the clearing. The wind was pushing the fire in their direction, and they had maybe 10 minutes before the clearing would be overrun. "I need you to trust me completely," Jake said, looking directly into Sarah's eyes. "I'm going to get you and your baby onto Thunder, and we're going to ride out of here together. It's going to be scary, but this horse has never let me down, and I promise you he won't let you down either." Sarah nodded, knowing she had no choice but to trust this stranger who'd appeared like an answer to her prayers. Jake moved with practiced efficiency, first helping Sarah up onto the horse behind him, then carefully positioning Emma between them where she'd be protected. He showed Sarah how to hold on properly, wrapping her arms around his waist and making sure Emma was secure against her chest. "Hold on tight, but try to move with the horse instead of fighting him," Jake instructed. "Thunder's going to be moving fast, but he knows these trails better than I do sometimes. Just trust him and trust me." As Jake spurred Thunder into motion, Sarah felt a mix of terror and hope unlike anything she'd ever experienced. The horse moved with surprising grace despite his size, picking his way carefully over rocks and fallen logs as they left the clearing behind. Sarah could feel the animal's powerful muscles working beneath them, and she began to understand why Jake had such confidence in his mount. Behind them, the clearing erupted in flames just minutes after they'd left it. Sarah looked back once and saw a wall of fire 20 feet high consuming everything in its path. If Jake hadn't found them when he did, she and Emma would have been trapped with no way out. The thought made her hold her baby even tighter and grip Jake's jacket with renewed determination. They rode hard through increasingly thick smoke, following what seemed to Sarah like no trail at all. But Jake clearly knew where he was going, guiding Thunder through the forest with the confidence of someone who'd grown up in these mountains. The horse never hesitated, even when they had to jump over fallen logs or navigate steep, rocky sections that would have been challenging on foot. Sarah began to believe they might actually make it out alive. The stranger who'd rescued them clearly knew what he was doing, and his horse seemed almost supernaturally sure-footed in the treacherous conditions. For the first time since she'd smelled smoke that morning, Sarah allowed herself to hope that she and Emma would live to see another day. As they rode deeper into the forest, leaving the fire behind them, Sarah realized that her quiet mountain life had just become anything but quiet. But she was alive, Emma was safe, and they had this mysterious cowboy to thank for it. Whatever happened next, she knew she owed Jake Morrison a debt she could never fully repay.